Many people believe just because insulation's there that it works. But what's just as important as how much insulation you have is how well it's installed. With me is Rick Chitwood from Chitwood Energy Management. And Rick, you make your living teaching contractors how to install insulation properly. What are the things you look for a quality insulation job in homes?
We look for three main things. First and most important thing is that the insulation is in contact with the air barrier.
Which is like the drywall?
Right, in this case, in the ceiling, it would be the drywall. The second thing is insulation voids, and the third thing is compressed areas.
You don't want to compress the insulation.
Exactly.
What makes an insulator work is its ability to trap air, so if you compress it, it doesn't work too good. Well, we have a piece of drywall here. Explain to me what you're talking about when you're referring to this air barrier issue.
So the drywall is the rigid material that separates the conditioned space from the unconditioned attic air. So we call it the air barrier. It's extremely important that the fiberglass insulation be installed in contact with the air barrier for it to perform properly.
So if you had gaps like this where air could flow through, that basically would short circuit the insulation, wouldn't allow it to work. I suppose it's just as important for floors over garages or crawl spaces, so that in that case the insulation is up against the bottom of the flooring to prevent air from passing through and carrying away the heat.
Exactly. We don't want any air spaces between the insulation and the air barrier. No live air spaces. We used to think they were dead air spaces and contributed to additional R value, but we know that there's always forces moving that air.
Now, what about pipes, ducts? This is ductwork, not a flue. It looks like this is pretty accurately installed around here.
Yeah.
What do you think about this?
The exhaust duct here for the range, they've done a good job at cutting and fitting the fiberglass without significant compression and without voids. This is very well done and often a difficult detail.
You wouldn't want it to look like this.
Exactly.
You want it to be carefully fitted, lofted, so that it comes in contact with the drywall at the same time, no air spaces. What about where insulation comes in contact with structural members?
Here they've done a good job to avoid voids. They've run the insulation clear to the outside edge so there's no void here. And at the same time they've made sure they haven't compressed it by forcing it into small cavities.
So you wouldn't want it to look like this, like it often does.
Exactly.
Now, what about light fixtures? You know, there's some real issues about light fixtures and fire. When I'm on a lot of job sites, I see that there's not a lot of detail sometimes paid to how they insulate around light fixtures.
Right. The older light fixtures, we were required to leave an airspace around them because they weren't rated for contact with insulation. All of the new ones are rated for insulation contact, so we're required to run the insulation right up to and over all the recessed light fixtures. Here they've done a good job at cutting and fitting without voids or compressions.
Wiring, big issue.
A huge issue. Wiring can cause all three problems. If the insulation is installed on top of the wiring, we end up with the insulation not in contact with the drywall. The insulation could be compressed underneath the wiring, and it could also create a void.
So the solution is to slit the insulation, layer it back, put the wiring in, and then layer back the insulation over.
Right.
What about pipes? I see we have a gas pipe here that looks like it's about 3.5. If you've typically got R38 in your attic, which is almost 12 inches, that's going to compress that quite a bit.
Right. What might happen here typically is that the whole bat would be installed under it, which would significantly compress it. Typically we need about 12 inches of insulation loft to get the rated R value. With a compressed clear under, that's a significant problem.
So what you want to do is make sure that you layer that insulation, you cut the insulation, fold it back, slide the thinner part of the insulation underneath the pipe, and then the other insulation going over the top of it.
Exactly.
Now also, I see a lot of air conditioning systems up in attics where they actually build a platform, set the air conditioning equipment up there. Many times that's an area that might be forgotten.
Right. It's easy to miss that spot. So underneath, the platform and the catwalks for the HVAC equipment need to be batted properly.
And that has to happen really before the catwalk gets built.
Yes.
Or the platform.
That makes it easier.
Rick, an area you don't want to forget is the attic access.
Yeah, people think it's not a big deal because it's just a few square feet, but not insulating the attic access hatch can be equal to about 150 square feet of insulated attic as far as the amount of heat loss through it. So it is a fairly significant deal. We should always permanently attach insulation. My favorite detail is to use a rigid foil-faced foam board and glue it to the attic access hatch.
Now, another area of the attic that requires a significant amount of consideration is knee walls, because they're often forgotten how to do that right.
That's true. We have a problem with air intrusion from the back side of the insulation on an attic knee wall. What they've done in this case is install a foil-faced paper on the back side, on the attic side of the attic knee wall. That prevents any air intrusion, which can reduce the performance of the attic knee wall insulation.
So this air barrier basically prevents heat from being scavenged away from the insulation.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, we've spent a little bit of time talking about bats, but fiberglass loose fill is also a very popular way to insulate attics.
Loose fill is a great alternative. In difficult to insulate attics like this, fiberglass loose fill can also be faster and easier. It's good at filling in around all the tight, small spots easier, and performs definitely as well as the fiberglass when installed properly.
What are your thoughts about getting a quality job there?
We typically look for two things: the total number of inches and the density.
How do you determine the density? I mean, I think that's an area that people often don't understand. Is, you know, it's one thing to blow the amount of inches of insulation in your attic, but how do you know if you got the right density?
Well, the installer, to get the correct number of the correct weight of insulation, actually counts the number of bags for the square footage of the attic. If we're measuring density, we actually take a core sample and weigh it to understand what the density is.
And that's probably why this insulation card is so important. This card here is sort of like your registration card that tells you how many bags were put in the attic.
Right. This has number of bags, the weight of the insulation per square foot, and it also gives us what the total R value is.
Yeah. And of course, can't forget the rulers.
Right, attic rulers. This one has nice big numbers so we can see it clear across the attic. A great addition to make it easy to get the right number of inches.
Now, another important part about insulating attics is making sure you don't blow those baffles full of insulation where the vents are. So you have baffles like this and other types that are designed to prevent those vents from getting filled.
Right. This is a foam chute. We also use cardboard, sometimes plywood, sometimes foil-faced foam board. And the intention is the same with all of them, is to make sure we maintain the 1.5 inches or so of free air space for venting.
That way any moisture that gets up into the attic from the home gets scavenged away by the ventilation system, and we don't want to fill those up.
Right. We also carry away excess heat in the summer.
Well, Rick, really appreciate all your help today. You've been a big help, and we'll look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.